Everybody, welcome to Hope Partnership's webinar today, Caring for Your Congregation's Volunteers. This is going to be a very insightful and engaging conversation about how we can care for the people who give so much to the mission of our congregations. And our presenter today is Dr. Rick Morse, who is Vice President for Missional Initiatives at Hope Partnership for Missional Transformation. I just want to offer a couple words of instruction as we get started today. Number one, if you haven't already, please do mute your phone. Otherwise, we've got about 50 or 60 people on the phone, and we're going to be hearing a lot of background noise. And so please do mute all your phones. That way we don't hear anything from your end. The first part of our presentation today is going to be led by Rick, and then we'll ask you if you have any questions at the end of the presentation. You can unmute your phone and ask your questions at that time. So please, if something comes up, question or comment, just jot it down, and we'll invite you to speak those comments and questions at the end of the presentation today. Also at the end of the presentation, we'll say just a word about Leadership Academy, which is coming up in September. The deadline for that is this weekend, so stay tuned. You'll hear more about that at the end of our session. Without any further ado, I want to turn it over to my friend and colleague, Rick Morse. Rick, what do you have for us today?
Well, I got a lot. I'd like to talk about volunteerism in the life of our congregations and how we can develop volunteerism. But before I really get started, I want to just say that there's been a lot. It's been drawn to my attention that there's been a lot of distinctions recently made about the difference between a volunteer and a disciple. A volunteer oftentimes is thought of as somebody who gives out of their leisure time, whereas a disciple gives time as a part of their spiritual discipline. Or a volunteer does mission to a community, while a disciple does mission with a community. Or that a volunteer usually is usually involving people of privilege, whereas a disciple is people of all means. And volunteers normally do time in a certain project and then leave, whereas a disciple commits to a cause. And I recognize those differences and nuances within the direct way in which the word volunteer is used. And I'm going to be pretty generic, though, in my use of the term volunteer, in meaning somebody who gives of their free time, who freely gives of their free time and is involved in terms of what it is that they're doing. My friend Lori Adams wrote a great note here earlier today. She said, disciples don't volunteer. They serve as followers of Jesus Christ. And within all of the people that give up their time, and I think if you think about your congregations and the organizations in which you serve, there are people that just really spend an awful lot of time working on all kinds of stuff for the sake of the church, for the sake of all of us. And so to get us started, I want to talk about the state of volunteerism, though, in the church today and what we're seeing happening and what's happening nationwide with volunteerism. I don't know if you know it or not, but only 26.8% of the U.S. population volunteers to do one thing during the course of the year. That only a quarter of our population actually does something for somebody else without being paid. In 1995, that number was 48.8%, so it's dropping very rapidly, the number of people that volunteer for any kind of project. And that's not just church work. That's all across the board for volunteerism. The age group that volunteers the most is actually the younger age groups, 35 to 44, which is an age group that's largely missing in most of our congregations today. Most volunteers are employed. They're not retired or unemployed people, but they're people that actually are working, and they spend an average of 51 hours a year doing it. People with higher educations are more likely to volunteer than people who are not. And the majority of volunteerism in the United States today is still within religious organizations. And it's estimated that volunteers gave 8.1 billion hours of service worth more than $158 billion to American communities throughout the country. Now, when we think about volunteers across the board, we can see that there is a lot of stuff that's going on. When we look at this person right here, you can tell that she's probably a candy striper. And if we were all able to talk, we would talk at this point. I would ask you, how could you tell that she's a candy striper? You'd probably say by the uniform. But she's given some way of recognition in terms of working with her organization that people understand that she is a volunteer in a hospital. Now, before she could begin to work as a candy striper in a hospital, she has to go through training. In fact, most anybody that volunteers in a hospital today has to go through infectious disease control training and other kinds of training so that they know how to engage in the hospital environment in a good and clever way. Not only are they going through training, they are up for it they're given a chance to do all kinds of stuff. And Xenia, I see you ask a question. Yeah, I'm sorry, none of us can help you right now. If you could just listen, I'll send you a copy of the PowerPoint when we get done. So, if you think about the ways in which we treat our healthcare volunteers, you notice that they give them training, they give them recognition by the outfit that they're wearing, and they give them the chance that they have to do the work that they're doing in a reasonable fashion. And so when doctors see this person, they know that they're a Candy Striper, they know they're a volunteer, they know if they gave them a task to do that they could send them to a room and they would do so efficiently and they would do so appropriately, knowing how to act and be in that situation. Church volunteers, on the other hand, though, don't necessarily do that with our volunteers. In fact, most of the time we use the Kit Carson method of recruitment to get somebody to volunteer for something. And so, you know, you might make an announcement on Sunday morning that we need somebody to volunteer to work with our junior high youth group. And, you know, how Buffalo Bill used to bag his buffalo out in the field. Buffalo Bill would go out there and all the buffalo would scatter, and he would shoot the buffalo that were still laying on the ground. So when you go to recruit that youth leader, we go into the parlor where everybody's having their cup of coffee after church on Sunday morning, and everybody scatters because they know you're looking for somebody that can volunteer to do this project. And we usually bag the person that can't get up off the sofa fast enough to get away. And the only kind of qualities that we're looking for is a warm body most of the time, just somebody that'll do the job. And the way we recruit them is by saying, you know, we need somebody to take care of the kids. It's your turn. You haven't done anything around here for a while. Go to work and do that. Instead of asking them or telling them that, you know, you've got an opportunity to do something that's going to make a huge difference in the lives of junior high kids at an age and a time when they are most susceptible to encountering the faith in a deep way. And you have a chance to make a large difference in their life. And so I think that the important part in all of this is to note that congregations normally just seek warm bodies, and we give very little care or very little training to people. We don't give them resources to work with, and most of the time we really kind of abuse our volunteers in the ways in which we work with them. And we're getting a lot of the return of that. We use basically our volunteers in 4 different ways. We use them for direct missional engagement, that is when they are working out in the field, doing ministry in a community, working with other people. We use them largely in educational ministries, working with children in Sunday school programs or with adults in other ways. That particular program area takes a lot of volunteer time. We use volunteers in decision making, and we use them in building and maintenance issues as well. And rarely do we ever resource them with the kinds of practical stuff that they need. I'm sorry, but somebody has their phone off mute, and we're hearing a lot of background noise. So anyhow, it's important for us to see how we use them and think of volunteers as a resource rather than wasting them on all kinds of things that really don't matter. For example, I was talking with a woman not too long ago who is an executive for the phone company. She has a very high position in the phone company. She's incredibly brilliant, very smart, very astute at organizing things. And the church that she's a part of put her on the committee to arrange flower arrangements for the CWF luncheon. Probably not real good use of her skills, her time, and her talent to do that. And probably not really good use of anybody's time to put a committee together to do something that an individual could probably come up with or begin to resource. Another thing that's interesting on decision-making processes like committees and boards and those kinds of structures, we spend on an average 2 hours talking about every 1 hour of mission delivery that we're doing in the life of congregations, which is kind of upside down from what it really needs to be if a congregation is truly going to be missional in its function and working with people in a good way. Another thing that's interesting, in most congregations today, you'll find that only 20 to 25% of participants do 80% of the work. In fact, Matt and I have been working with some congregations where it's really only about 10% of the people doing 90% of the work in a congregation. This has changed over the years. It used to be about 30% of a congregation or 40% of a congregation would do 60% of the work. But these numbers seem to be changing as congregations get smaller, and the more a congregation has been in decline, the fewer people there are to step up to the plate. And normally what we do is we keep those same leaders for a long period of time. And by keeping those leaders for a long period of time, we get no changes in the ways in which our church work is going on. Leaders use volunteers wisely. A poll in 1995 showed that 58% of all Americans would volunteer for something if they thought the organization would make good use of their time. And 40% of volunteers have quit volunteering because, number one, we weren't making good use of their time. Secondly, we weren't making good use of their talents. Third, tasks are not clearly defined. And finally, and very importantly, nobody thanked them. So what we try to do is we get people to do impossible jobs for the life of the church. So say that during the week you're an executive somewhere or you manage organization of some sort. We put you to work painting a wall in the life of the church, and you're really not that good a painter to start with, but you always say yes. And they don't tell you exactly which room to paint. And at the end of the day, even though you're dog-tired and everything has gone wrong, somebody comes in and tells you how lousy a job you did on that room. So it's no wonder that fewer and fewer people are volunteering to do the tasks that they're called to do. Most churches choose the easiest path of using the same leaders over and over again. And what we are finding out is that pastors that are engaged in peer groups that have good peer support systems in place are more likely to rotate more leaders through the life of a congregation. And what we see in transformed congregations is that transformative congregations, the ones that are really making a difference in their community and making a difference in the lives of people, are the ones that are really going through quite a bit of work in rotating leadership through. And they use, through this rotational process, they use the methods of helping people through mentorship and coaching to become the kind of leaders that they're called to be. Now, when you look at how congregations develop, you can kind of see how we get into this malaise of using the same people over and over again, not training our leaders, and not resourcing people. One of the things that occurs when a congregation first starts, you've all been through life cycle with me before probably, all they have is energy and vision. As that vision gets understood by more and more people, the congregation then begins to develop relationships with each other. And based on the integrity of those relationships, they begin to volunteer in this section and develop programmatic life within the life of the congregation. It's only when we get to this point that somebody says, let's get organized, that a church begins to decline. But most importantly is that this relationship part and this program part go hand in hand. It's really important to note that without integrity of relationships, if people don't like each other, they're not going to volunteer to be a part of any of the church programmatic stuff that needs to happen. The same is true if we are going to ask them to be missional in their focus. If they don't have a relationship with the living God, if they don't have a relationship with the community, if they don't have a relationship to where they understand what's going on in the world around them, they're not going to have the integrity to work in volunteer life. That's where equipping is really an important part of our strategy for working with volunteers into the future. Now, unfortunately, as a congregation begins to decline, it loses an idea about what its vision really was to start off with. The relationships begin to break down, and if you don't have relationships with each other, the program falls apart. You can no longer get volunteers to work in programmatic areas, teach Sunday school people. You know, if I don't like your teenage kids, I'm not going to spend time with them in youth group. And so on this side of the life cycle, a congregation becomes transactional. On this side, it is creative, and it's taking initiatives and it's doing new things. But on this side of the life cycle, the congregation becomes very transactional. That means they want to do the same thing over and over again and expect some different results from that. And what happens is that volunteers become very transactional in the way in which they approach the work that they're called to do. There becomes a system, one way of doing things, and the congregation gets stuck in a rut. So, for example, when I was a pastor in Seattle, I never will forget, we got a person to volunteer one time to bring cookies to the coffee hour. And this person was very new to the church, and she saw that as a way that she could contribute to the life of the congregation. But yet she, when she set up her cookies, she put the cookies too close to the edge of the table, and one of the other members of the church had a fit over the fact that these cookies were too close to the edge of the table because we know children might get to those, and you know, that would be the end of all world peace if a child got a cookie, an unauthorized cookie or something like that. You know, when a congregation gets into transactional ways of being, it becomes very difficult for volunteers to work in that environment and for volunteers to do anything outside of the normal box. And so what happens in a healthy congregation is a different kind of model, especially if a congregation is going through this U, which is a transformational process. We begin to take a break from being transactional in the way in which we are the church, and we become transformational. And this downward slope is where a congregation learns to let go of old ways of being, where it begins to let go of its understanding of what the volunteers do in the life of that church, when it begins to let go of cookies not being on the edge of the table. When it can let those things go, it's going through a transformational process. And what Otto Scharmer in his book Theory U says, for transformation to occur, a person has to let go in order to let something new come. So if you think about an alcoholic, for example, in order for them to receive new life and for them to transform their lives, they have to let go of alcohol, and they have to let go of their old habits. They have to let go of old friendships, old ways of being, in order to become something new. And the same is true for any biblical character that you ever look at through the scriptures. You'll see that most of the time that every biblical character that did that has gone through transformational process, has let go of something. Abraham and Sarah let go of their home in order to become father and mother of a great new nation. You know, you could look at the children of the Exodus, of Israel, when they were in the Exodus. They let go of slavery. They let go of all kinds of stuff in order to go through that transformational process of getting to the promised land, even though at one point they wanted to go back. I'm sure you remember the story of the rich young ruler when he comes to Jesus and he says, what do I have to do to have eternal life? And Jesus says, sell everything you have. He wasn't willing to let go of his financial means in order to become something new. What we're really looking for in volunteers, and what volunteers really want to do, is be initiators of new things, not transactional leaders of old things that have been going on since the 40s. They want to begin new things, and they need to have the space where they have creative space within the life of a congregation to begin to spread their wings and try to do that. And most of our congregations, if they're stuck in this transactional phase, are not going to be able to bridge the gap between being an initiator and moving on. In my next webinar next month, I'm going to be talking more about leadership styles and how that relates, but I just wanted you to get kind of a basic understanding of where this is and how this works and how people come together in terms of what we do to our volunteers. So if you could just use your imagination for a minute, imagine how we could change this picture by expanding leadership within the life of our congregation, to even maybe include somebody that looks like this woman here on this slide. Creating a safe space for new and different ideas, for learning to ask good questions, to getting leaders to think adaptively and theologically about what we're doing. You know, why are we doing a yard sale? Have we ever thought about the need of this, or is it just to support us institutionally? Is there something that we could do that gets us connected to God's mission in whatever it is we're doing? And actually getting something done and developing a missional mindset. So you're probably wondering, how on earth do we get there? Well, there's a number of ways to get there, but one of the important things to remember is that a transformational leader in a congregation moves a group of volunteers to a place they would not have gone themselves. It's important to recognize that with volunteers, they're not working at the congregation because they're being paid to do it. They're working there freely because of their commitment to Jesus Christ and because of their desire intrinsically to be engaged in God's mission and to be instruments of God's coming peace for that. And so what we're talking about really is behaviors per church. The kind of volunteerism that we're talking about can't be taught because it's about behavior, about being initiators. It's about practice. And the only way to do it is like that kid in the pool. You don't learn how to swim by reading a book about it or going to a workshop. You learn to swim by getting into the water and learning how to do that. And at some points you need people that can coach you along the process. At other points you have all the gifts that you need in terms of doing that. But volunteer leadership is also more about inspiration than motivation. I have this picture of this girl where they're trying to put some food down her throat that she's probably not too enamored with at this point in her life. You know, that's kind of how we treat our leaders sometimes. We say, we've got this horrible job that we want you to do, and you need to do it because we want you to follow our vision as a church. We want you to follow our direction that we have set for ourselves. But volunteer leadership is more about inspiration. It's about finding those things that are intrinsically within people already and helping fan the flames on their fires so that they can become meaningful leaders in the way in which they do that. Well, we have a number of services at Hope Partnership, and we'll be taking some questions here, but one of the services that we do have works on behaviors of leaders called The Journey. And The Journey is a 2-year process, a collection of resources that empowers church leaders to realize their purpose through collaborative work that unleashes their creativity and courage in this new era of God's mission. And I think that you can find that on our website if you want to learn more about The Journey. We have a Dare to Lead event coming up in a couple areas in Texas. We are also going to be in the capital area and a number of regions, Alabama, Northwest Florida, number of regions here in the very near future. And so if you'd like to learn more about that, I hope you'll be able to ask about that. But at the end of that 2-year process with The Journey, we try to work on inspiring volunteers or lay leadership or disciples, really, to be those kinds of inspirational leaders that focus on trying to lead volunteers to a new place. We also try to create an environment that fosters creativity within a congregation and gain higher community engagement. You know, so many of our churches look at their context for ministry as being within the 4 walls of their congregation rather than looking broadly at their community and about what it is they're called to be and do, and getting greater participation from all the people that are there. So that's basically all I had. I certainly would enjoy your comments or your questions or any of that kind of stuff.